Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Point Forward podcast. It is trade deadline edition. Well, there might be more, actually. Who knows if this is the last trade deadline pod, but there is a really, really big trade that the Milwaukee Bucks just consummated on Wednesday. Khris Middleton, the playoff star legend, Bucks legend. I feel comfortable saying that unironically. Bucks legend Khris Middleton has been dealt to the Washington Wizards. Coming back to the Bucks will be Kyle Kuzma, a almost 30-year-old forward, 6'9" forward, and then Patrick Baldwin Jr., kind of an unrealized prospect at this point. He is from sort of from the Milwaukee area, played high school ball at Sussex Hamilton, and played college basketball at UW Milwaukee for his father, Pat Sr. So that's an interesting subplot. AJ Johnson, the team's first-round pick this past year, also going to Washington in the deal. Khris Middleton no longer a member of the Milwaukee Bucks, and I've got people here to talk about it with me. Did I say my name is J.R. Radcliffe? I don't know if I did, but I'm J.R. Radcliffe of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and I'm joined by Jim Owczarski, Bucks reporter for the Journal-Sentinel, and Lori Nichols, sports columnist. Hello, Lori. It is a big time moment when Lori Nichols is on the show. Lori, how are you?
No, I just got out of the gym and I saw the news, and I at first I was trying to figure out who they were talking about. I'm like, is it Portis? What's going on? And then when I heard it was Middleton, just shocking.
Yeah, I didn't even get to the gym. I was there, and Jim was like, "Oh, by the way, this deal's going down." So I ran back upstairs to start typing away. Jim, I want to start with just some general thoughts on this trade. I think if I tried to explain to somebody that Khris Middleton, who's been with the Bucks a decade, was just dealt in what I think might have financial considerations above all else, I think people would look at me really crazy. I think there's more to it than just that, but getting below the second tax apron in this current NBA salary cap feels kind of like the goal of this trade. Now, Kuzma is going to help them. He's going to be a regular contributor. He's a few years younger than Khris Middleton. I think Khris Middleton's the better player, even right now, even coming off the ankle surgery. Maybe that's arguable. Give me your general thoughts of what this trade accomplishes for the Milwaukee Bucks and what you think. And you wrote at jsonline.com kind of why they made this deal now, but maybe what they're thinking here.
Yeah, I mean, John Horst, whenever he's available to speak, will better be able to answer the exact whys and hows. But there are some, as you mentioned, implications beyond just a trade. And you're right. You open this like Khris Middleton is, I would call him comfortably the third best player in franchise history. And so that's no small thing. Traded for a guy who, Kyle Kuzma is like not a really great player, good player at all.
He's a guy.
Role player, maybe. So I'm really fascinated to hear how Doc Rivers and John Horst tell us he's going to fit and make this a championship team. And who knows? As we're recording this, maybe there's some other pieces before Thursday that maybe Kyle isn't maybe the big part here. But you mentioned the financial element. Yeah, like the Bucks were a second apron team. What does that mean? Very briefly, it basically meant if they finished this year in this apron, John Horst, Bucks front office, could not trade their 2032 draft pick this summer. For some reason, I feel like that is not a good enough reason to not try to win a championship this year. I don't know mandates from Wes Edens and Jimmy Haslam as we record this. My impression from those two gentlemen, the Bucks co-owners, was that they knew they were in the apron this year. Money really wasn't a factor because they signed all these deals. They acquired data. Like they kind of knew this. Like this didn't affect the 2031 draft picks, right? So I don't know. John Horst have to better explain all of this. But yeah, like Kyle Kuzma makes far less money than Khris Middleton because he's not as good a player. And I guess we'll have to see how this fits going forward. I'm not quite sure yet how this makes them better, other than they were really struggling to find some symmetry with Dame and Giannis and Khris. And it's looked fabulous at times. Other times it has looked not so good. And so I don't know if they were just thinking that those stops and starts couldn't be ironed out by June, or couldn't be ironed out soon enough where they could capture the 3 or the 4 seed. Whereas this move clearly frees up Damian Giannis to be the offense, to be the engine. They don't have to like work another guy in to find his rhythm, to get him going. Like Kyle Kuzma is just the guy. So clearly this is a lean into Giannis and Dame and how good they can be and where they can take this team.
Jim, I don't know if you feel this way. I think this deal sucks if you're the Bucks. Like if you're a Bucks fan, and I'm even setting aside the emotional stuff, which I want to get to as well. But like they just sold away a guy who has been an essential piece of what they have going on. But like if he is healthy, that is what, we've talked about. How can this team realistically look at itself as a playoff contender? Well, it's because if in this scenario where Khris, Dame, and Giannis are all healthy, okay, those guys actually are a team that can make it to the Eastern Conference Finals. Now it's a long shot to say they'll all be healthy, but it is at least plausible. I don't think a team with Dame, Giannis, and Kyle Kuzma can get further than the team with Middleton instead. Like that seems crazy to me. So I guess I don't know. Maybe that's too down way of looking at it. I guess I hate going into a trade for any sport where it's like, well, what else is there to come? Is this the first domino of many? Because it's never like that. It never works that way. It does sometimes, and that makes people think that's how it works all the time. But I guess I'll ask, do you think this is the first domino or just the table setter for whatever move is still to come?
It's hard to say because look, in previous conversations, like the Bucks were interested in Zach LaVine, right, in Chicago. That was discussed. In order for that to happen, Pat Connaughton would have had to have been moved here to get on the apron, and Bobby and Khris would have to be traded for Zach LaVine and Jalen Smith. Now, like if Pat was traded and that was like sort of floating out there, like I could see that, right? And those pieces, to your point. This I'm not quite sure where else they could go. Like technically they can aggregate salaries now, but I think it's been proven that Bobby and Pat on their own are not like desirable assets for teams. We have seen this team crater in the last week and a half without Bobby Portis as he was home. He actually is back now, by the way. We thought that'd be the news of the day. Dealing with his family as his grandmother had passed. Like they need Bobby Portis. So I guess if there's a trade for a third big that's not Bobby, okay. I don't see, I guess, JR, if we're living in like weird Luka Doncic is traded fantasy land, maybe someone in Miami or Golden State or Phoenix wants Kyle Kuzma, and then the Bucks are now involved with that and someone else arrives in Milwaukee. But you're right, there's a lot of time before the deadline, but it's really hard to forecast that because it could be anything, it could be nothing.
Lori, let's go to the emotional side of this to start. Because
I'm not ready.
You're not ready to move on.
Oh man.
Jim said third best player in Bucks franchise history. I think people will initially think that and maybe balk at that. It's like, well, what about like Ray Allen and a lot of there's a lot of guys who hang from the rafters who's maybe they shouldn't be from the rafters, but like there's a lot of guys up there. And Middleton has never been able to exist outside of the Giannis sphere, like even though he's had those incredible individual games, saved their season in 2021 in the playoffs when Giannis was injured. I mean, he has had some incredible individual moments. I think he will always be seen as the guy who played with Giannis and the guy who won a title, but also who played with Giannis. As you start to accumulate in your mind what you think his legacy is, and I imagine you'll be writing about this at JS Online as well. What is the Khris Middleton legacy, and what are you thinking right now, knowing that he's going to, man, poor Khris Middleton, going to Siberia? No offense to Washington. I love the capital. It's a fun city, but like that is not where you want to play basketball for the remainder of this season.
What do you mean? The last winning season they had was 2017, 2018. Oh my goodness, they are terrible. So Giannis Antetokounmpo will be the first person to tell you this. In 2013, he was drafted in June. A month later, they traded for Khris Middleton. There are 4 guys who have been around since that time. General manager John Horst and the Vice President of NBA Operations, Dave Dean. Those 4 guys have been the Milwaukee Bucks since that time, more than a decade. They built this up. They went through the 15-win season. They went through so much together, to the pandemic, the lockout, walking off the court in protests. They've done all of that, and they won the first championship in 50 years. My first question is also, how is Giannis handling this right now? The emotional aspects to me are so layered. I mean, Khris Middleton was just benched, and Jim, how was he handling coming off the bench? To me, he looked like he was handling it like a pro. I thought, well, maybe this is the phase of his career that he can handle being kind of more of a role player. The truth is, though, he has always been the most professional teammate I think I can think of. So complimentary. The attention was always on Giannis, and then it was on Dame. He always was okay with being an unbelievably good passer on the team. Yes, he gambled and he would get turnovers occasionally, but he could just break the backs of defenses with incredible passing. He's got the classic alley-oop to Giannis. That was another key play of his. The mid-range shot, that's his shot. He was never a dunker, but he could just hit from anywhere on the court. But to me, his leadership, when you look at all the highlights on YouTube, if you feel like looking at it for nostalgia reasons, the person who is talking to Giannis the most through all the coaching differences from J Kidd on through, it was always Khris and Giannis on the bench talking strategy, taking those conversations from the bench onto the court. Still, sometimes they almost looked like, not that they were arguing, but that they were confronting each other. You do this, you do that. That there's a relationship there between the two of them that I've not seen with anybody else. And I include Thanasis in there. Thanasis Antetokounmpo obviously is very close to his brother, but Khris could say whatever needed to be said and be done. And we just saw that last week when it was Khris on the court telling Giannis to get away, from any confrontation on the court. Don't get into it with other players. So the legacy of Khris Middleton is that he never needed the spotlight. He was a late bloomer. He was a second round guy who made this incredible career. He was always okay with being overshadowed by other people on the team, meaning that his ego was okay with it. He still had his pride. He was a great passer. I think he could be a great NBA coach if he's willing to put up with the schedule. Very smart, knows every play and position on the team, knows what they're supposed to be doing. Remember, during the Adrian Griffin era, he was trying to assemble the guys and get them to get certain plays off when they didn't necessarily know what was being called from the bench. I could go on and on and on. This is a huge loss for all those emotional reasons. But how is he handling it? How is Giannis handling it? I imagine this couldn't have been very easy when you think about it was just those 4 guys in 2013 at the very start of this little Bucks dynasty here.
Yeah. So Giannis, uncharacteristically, Lori, spoke at shoot around this morning. And so just for fans to know, Giannis typically doesn't speak at shoot arounds at all. He talks almost every post game. And while he first acknowledged that at the time he spoke, the trade wasn't official, Khris was not in the building. Everyone knew, again, unless something weird happened. But Giannis, it wasn't overly like emotional in the moment, sort of like that kind of way, but did speak, and his comments and video of him is up at jsonline.com right now. But did say that, he's gotten better at handling this, reacting to it when a teammate is traded. But he's like, I've spent more time with him than my family, which says a lot because Giannis spends a lot of time with his family. And he said, it's how Lori began. He's like, there was this one great moment, which is the championship. He's like, but it's all those other times, the losing, the heartbreak, the when it was just us and like the team, the city, the organizations depending on us to do these things, is where kind of he was thinking. And he did say, like, when you win with people, it's hard. And he kind of said it'll be hard when Brooks no longer a teammate or Bobby's no longer a teammate, etc. But you're right, Lori. I think, look, Khris and Giannis, it's one of my favorite stories from the championship run, of the two of them figuring out the alpha dance as these guys who are throw-ins, or this lottery ticket, right? That Giannis was, and then Jabari gets hurt, which has Khris ascend, and it's pretty remarkable. I think almost 700 games together. I think they were the longest running pair in the league outside of Steph and Draymond. It's such a unique circumstance in so many ways. And Lori captured a lot of that just great there. So yeah, like, I understand Bucks fans for many years got frustrated with him, always thought he was overpaid or whatever it was. But I will say this, if he hadn't been snubbed in 2020 for a playoff berth, we're talking about a borderline Hall of Famer. I mean, he's been to 3 All-Star games. He's won Olympic gold medal, won a championship. He doesn't have that 4th All-Star, or the 2nd title, which tends to get you in there. But, in terms of his status, and to Lori's point, no one could talk to Giannis the way Khris did. So if we're going on court a little bit, we've heard Dame talk about trying to figure that out with Giannis. Like, how do we communicate with one another and not feel like I'm trying to assert something? Like, I'll never forget this. Giannis and Khris went at each other on the bench in Miami. You guys remember this? Like, the TV broadcast caught it. They're like screaming at each other. And then the very next play on the court is the patented pick and roll lob dunk. You know what I mean? And so, like, it's so fascinating in that way. And they both got frustrated with each other, mad at each other for various things, but it was always the team first. And the success of the team has shown it. And it's just one of those things where it's weird that Khris Middleton is traded for, as it stands, a player who's maybe just a contributor. And we'll have to see how this all shakes out. But yeah, to Lori's point, it's weird. It's different than Drew. Drew was a championship player, a great guy, but he was around for 2 seasons or 3 seasons, right? Like, this is, I mean, Lori, JR, you guys could compare it to, like, the long-term Brewers players. I'm trying to think of a Packer who was traded that didn't retire and then unretire or leave via free agency. It's just kind of different, and I do think whenever Khris comes back to Milwaukee, be it this year or next year for whatever team he's on, I imagine that will feel a certain kind of way when he comes back.
Lori saying, how does Giannis feel about it? I also don't feel like any move of this magnitude is made without at least consulting Giannis, and maybe that's overstating it, but I'm sure in some ways this was explained to him as a possible way to make this team better, and that's obviously going to be meaningful to Giannis. What have you seen as you've seen Khris here this season, Lori? What is your impression of how he's played? Like, maybe I'm overstating it when I say the way for this team to win is to have all these 3 guys magically be healthy. Maybe that wasn't true. Maybe this version of Khris Middleton wasn't going to be able to help this team win a championship. And if that's the case, the deal makes a little more sense, or a lot more sense, because as we talked about on the last podcast, pretty good chance Middleton isn't here through the offseason. Ditto for a lot of the guys that aren't Giannis and Dame, quite honestly. So if they're going to start, mostly tabula rasa, what's the difference now? Maybe you catch lightning in a bottle. If you assess that this isn't a championship team, that makes sense. What did you see from him? Like, how would you assess this version of Khris Middleton?
Well, I would go back, first of all, to the playoffs of last season, and Khris Middleton played his heart out. Remember? I mean, he gave everything, and there was no Giannis with the injury at one point. I thought that Middleton could serve a really good purpose coming off the bench the way he was, that as long as he's not doing 32 to 35 minutes a game, that could work. Again, because while he has his pride, he has this selflessness of he can come in and play at it, and he may not get in the same rhythm that he was before scoring wise, but he's so valuable with his leadership, mentorship, with his ability to say what needs to be said out there, his guidance, his observations. I thought he had a lot of value. And I also want to emphasize that what we see in games is just a fraction of it. The leadership really comes in play during practices or on the road when you're traveling for how many ever days, and how you handle yourself as a professional. How he's still so devoted to his routines, his shooting routines, his passing routines. He gets all that in. That sets an example for younger players like Andre Jackson Jr. or other guys who might need a little bit of a nudge or a motivating factor. So I thought he would help this year. But it's funny that we talk about these Bucks being possibly championship contenders this year when, you know, they have it in maybe roster name only. They haven't really shown much other than the sprint to Las Vegas, which is quirky and weird anyway. So I'm still processing all of this. I can't say that it makes a whole lot of sense to me if you're trying to really capture everything this year.
All right, Jim, we'll go back to Khris and Kuzma in a second, but AJ Johnson real briefly. Like, the whole point of this draft was to draft lottery tickets for the distant future, because we talked about, like, wow, that's an interesting choice to not go after somebody who can help you today.
I was going to say that was argued at the time of, like, should that have been what they were doing?
Right.
But yeah, go ahead.
Wouldn't it not have made sense to get somebody, you know, like, I could definitely see the argument for both sides. And then they go and just move this guy before he's in the organization for a full season. And I think he'd been showing, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, showing a little bit of promise. I mean, long way away still, but you know, it wasn't like their perceived plan wasn't working. It seemed like, okay, yeah, eventually you could see where he'd be contributing. I just can't imagine that Kyle Kuzma is worth so much by himself that they would be willing to punt on that part of the experiment as well. Because if that's the case, then for goodness sake, use your draft picks to help your team. Don't draft guys for the future and then not live through the future. You know, that makes no sense. But maybe again, it's that apron. Like, yeah, we had to do it because you have to get below the apron. If you want to truly bolster this team, you have to put yourself in position to do that. So maybe that second apron is just like Lord of the NBA at this point, and that's really something I should maybe come to terms with. But AJ Johnson, man, what do you think about that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. I think AJ Johnson was put in the deal, and there might be some like future second round swaps, like out in 31, whatever.
Yeah, I don't care about
AJ Johnson
when I'm
AJ Johnson's the sweetener. So. Yeah, AJ Johnson's a sweetener in this. He's a first round draft pick, right? So he's in his rookie year. So unlike Marjan Beauchamp now, who, you know, the Bucks have not picked up his option, that's clearly over. There's still the promise of AJ Johnson, dynamic athlete. A lot of people didn't understand his selection to begin with. Maybe John Horst saw him as a guy who could be dealt with. He could be a sweetener in a deal, that he had enough potential at 19 when he was drafted. He just turned 20 on December 1st. That other teams would say, yeah, he's so raw. Like he could be something. So the future of this team is whenever Giannis is done. Like while Giannis Antetokounmpo is in a Bucks uniform, that's the future. The present is the future. So AJ Johnson was never going to be a part of that. Because we're talking 6 years from now, right? Should Giannis stay and be whatever? So I think that's.
Shouts to Tyler Smith, by the way. Keep a bag packed, buddy.
So AJ, I think, is just unfortunately a part of this transaction. You had asked Lori about like Khris fitting in with this. Look, assuming this is the trade. And whether Pat Connaughton is moved for a little, like Pat's sort of out of the rotation when they've been healthy. So let's assume this is the trade. Kyle Kuzma will be 30 in July. So he's a little bit younger. He's been in the league 8 years. So he kind of is who he is. On some bad Washington teams, he averaged 20 points a game. I don't think that really applies to the Bucks. I'm sure they're looking at his time in LA. You know, he was a bench player, role player that help them win the bubble championship. You know, he's 6'9", adds some length. He's not a good 3-point shooter. 33% for his career. Typically that goes up when you play with Giannis, but that would really be remarkable for him to be really good at 3-point shooting suddenly.
And he's having just
he's not a good,
really bad year.
Yeah, shooting. He's not a good shooter overall at 40%. So maybe there's some defensive stuff there. I mean, his metrics early in his career. So again, if the Bucks are thinking that they're getting the guy who last played in LA 4 years ago, as this sort of high-level defender, I don't know if he's still that guy. He's been on a bad team for 4 seasons. So we'll see. I think, like I said earlier, maybe they just feel like the Giannis Dame thing with some more athleticism can create different space, can create more dynamic offense, while also having this defender who can play, more minutes than Khris. So I'm guessing that's the vision here. Does that help him win a championship this year? I don't know. To me, look, Khris Middleton was re-signed before they traded for Dame. And I think the Dame acquisition just shifted the rotation of this planet. And Adrian Griffin made no sense after that. Khris Middleton, to a degree, didn't make much sense after that, in terms of just how they all could fit together. So maybe this is just part of the Bucks trying to correct that or shift it to a more upright on the axis, if this planetary, analogy works at all. So we'll just have to see. But yeah, it feels like when, are Giannis and Dame enough? And clearly right now, that's what the Bucks have to be banking on.
Lori, a couple days ago, Jim and I talked similar to this conversation that we're having here, that, this offseason could be, they could circle the wagons. They could just build, start over around Giannis and Dame and be fine again next year, be very good even next year. I look at it more as like they're coming to the end of the era here, and it's going to fall off a cliff, because at some point you're talking about two 30-year-old plus dudes. And I don't know if I see a great future after that, but how do you feel? And maybe this move recontextualizes some things for you, where you think big picture the Milwaukee Bucks are. I mean, do you think they're at the end of an era, or they're just, like Jim just said, maybe for a while they were trying to square peg in a round hole, or vice versa, whatever the analogy is, and then they're finally getting around to the point where they're sort of crafting this team around these two superstars, and they're going to figure out how to make this all work together eventually? How do you? I mean, does this feel like desperation to you, or really just kind of the next move toward a different looking future that can also be very successful for the Bucks?
Well, shoot, if I could answer that, man, I would be the GM. I think it's a really, really tough question. It's definitely the end of an era right now. I mean, it's definitely the end. I mean, no Khris with Giannis, that changes everything. It changes, in part, the locker room, the chemistry on the team. It changes, how, Khris was the complimentary guy. He was always willing to just be in the background of everything. And yet you could count on him for a certain amount of points and assists every game. I think it's the end of an era for sure. And that's just kind of what this is. And maybe they just need to start planning for a somewhat youth movement where they can get guys who can eat up a lot of minutes and play with high energy to balance out Giannis and Dame. But I do think Khris Middleton, whether, it was Father Time that took away some of his playing ability, or whether it's this trade now that he's gone, he will be missed on so many layers and levels. And that will continue on the rest of the season and for seasons to come. He really was an all-around guy.
Jim, what's next, man? What do you need to know now? Like, is it a situation where it's like, well, I don't know who the starting lineup's going to be, if Kuzma is going to be a starter coming off the bench, or, is Giannis going to play the 5 now a lot more? I mean, what questions are rattling?
That's no.
The answer is no. What is rattling around your head here as this thing moves forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. So look, Kyle Kuzma in Washington was a starter. They traded for him. They gave him an extension. I guess they thought at the time in 21, 22, he could be a star or, a piece to winning. He has no status in Milwaukee. He's not an all-star or anything close. So to me, he can be used in whatever way Doc Rivers sees fit. He started a bunch of games in the 18-19 season in LA. I don't know entirely the background there, but would it shock me if he's a bench player? If they just want to rock with Taurean Prince playing next to Giannis and they feel that's the best starting combination, and then Kuzma fits in, or if they think Taurean might be better served off the bench. Like, I could see either or. It changes a little bit of their small ball lineups. Like without Bobby this last week, Doc Rivers said there was one benefit is they got to see a lot of that. And actually the small ball lineups with Brook were better than the ones with Giannis. And I don't know if that changed. I mean, Kyle Kuzma can't really shoot, so I don't know. Like, that doesn't really fit with Giannis. And he's not a passer, so that also, I guess we'll have to see who and what there. But it changes, who can play there. And again, I don't know what kind of defense yet he's been playing in Washington. But again, if he can still defend, that could give them some options, some flexibility in that way. So yeah, we'll see. I know some fans have asked an email like, when we play, like, as we record this deal is not official yet. So that means no physicals have been taken and any of that stuff. So, we'll have to wait to see how all that shakes out when Doc Rivers can actually get to it.
Actually, let me throw a question to you guys as well. How much is defense a concern for the Bucks right now? Because, in 2019, for example, Khris Middleton defended the other team's best player. That's how good of a defender he was. Now, even just by the role of the fact that he comes off the bench, he can't be that kind of defensive player. Are the Bucks trying to, and Giannis has been complaining in recent games, that we need to play better defense and all that. How much do you think any of these moves might factor in team defense and the team's priority with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. If Kuzma can still be that guy, I mean, it's probably an upgrade in that way because he's also big. Like Khris, to your point, Lori, I think people didn't understand how big Khris is at 6'8". And that matters. And the Bucks lean into that. And Kuzma's 6'9". So if he can still move, look, Khris has lost his step. I mean, he's had 2 ankle surgeries, a knee surgery. Even he'd probably grudgingly admit that. What's fascinating about that question, Lori, is from November 12th through January 23rd. So when the losing streak ended and when Bobby went home, and AJ Green was hurt too, they had a top 5 defense in the league. They had the 3rd best record in the league behind Oklahoma City and Cleveland. They had a top 5 defense and a top 9 offense. And Khris missed some of those games, and Khris played in some of those games, right? That was right before he came back and right after. That's a pretty good sample size of really high-level ball. I seem to think that them crashing out this last week was because Brook was playing 35 minutes and his back hurt, and Giannis was playing 36 minutes and his body is just sore. Like when we asked 3 games into this trip without Bobby, we asked Giannis, how do you feel? And he just starts rubbing his ribs and sort of playfully wincing because he hates playing the 5 that much. So I guess I didn't quite see it as this massive defensive problem. But again, I'm not a general manager. Maybe they just thought Khris wasn't going to ever get there. We all sort of assumed at some point he would play 30 minutes, 35 minutes. But maybe their medical staff and John Horst were like, he's not going to get there. And if that's the case, maybe JR, to your point, this was a lean into, well, on offense, we've got these two guys. And then on defense, we need someone who can get us some shots. I guess just for me, I've seen Dame play against the Celtics and the Cavs and the Thunder, and they've really struggled at times against those teams. Like having Khris as a ball handler and having Khris as a dude who you have to respect and you have to double team. They don't have that now. And I'm really fascinated to see what happens to the way teams defend Dame on offense. Clearly they feel they've got some answers for that.
Yeah, you just saying the Celtics. That's of course Khris Middleton's specialty is and I don't lean too heavily into player X is so good against team Y. But I don't even know if the Bucks are going to end up facing the Celtics. I don't know if they're ever going to get to that point in the road, but that's just one less option in their holster. Bucks again will be playing the Hornets. If you're listening to this on Wednesday, they're in Charlotte. That's where Jim Owczarski is right now. They got games against the Hawks, 76ers, Warriors coming up. Golden State will be in here on February 10th at Pfizer Forum. By then, I imagine Kyle Kuzma will be here. So we'll see how the fit goes. Thank you so much for joining me, Jim Owczarski and Lori Nickel. Find everything they have at jsonline.com. Lots and lots of coverage of this Khris Middleton trade. He is now a Washington Wizard, and the Bucks have a little bit of a different look. Still 24 hours to go before the official trade deadline, and that could be in more moves in the offing. Like you said, Jimmy Butler is still out there. I don't think that would work for the Bucks personally, but other people are interested. They're interested in seeing if that could be something that happens. So we will see. Man, that would be such a different team than what it is right now. Thank you for tuning into this edition of the Point Forward podcast. We'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.